A gunshot tears the desert night wide open. The first torch lands on the stable roof, dry as tinder. The woman doesn't run. She kneels in the churned mud, both hands pressed hard against a wound going black in the firelight. Her hands shake. Her eyes don't. Out past the fence, 12 torches crawl up the red slope. Slow. Unhurried. Because men who come unhurried are men who already believe they've won. On the table behind her, a ledger lies open. The numbers climb too evenly to be called bad luck. Somebody built this. Patient. Brick by brick. Wind pushes through the gaps in the boards. Carries smoke. Carries lamp oil. And carries something else, a smell she first learned 2 years ago, the night everything began sliding sideways. She wipes the blood on her skirt. Reaches for the rifle standing by the door. The hoofbeats reach the fence line. Then stop. The wind got to everything first. Before the sound of hooves. Before the creak of the gate. Before anyone in Marrow Flat knew a stranger was coming, the wind already knew. It came down off the mesa dry, as bone and pushed, through the cracks in the trading post walls, rattled the tin cups on their hooks, stirred the dust, that never really settled, not here, not in this corner of the New Mexico territory, where the earth seemed to hold its breath and wait. Spring, 1882. Addie Foster stood behind the counter of her father's store, and wiped it down for the 3rd time that morning. Not because it was dirty. Because her hands needed something to do, that wasn't shaking. She was 24 years old. Old enough to know better than to hope. Young enough to still do it anyway, in small stubborn ways she didn't admit to herself. Old enough, too, to know exactly what it looked like, when a man's whole life started slipping sideways, because she'd been watching it happen to her father for 2 years straight, one bad night at a time. Her mother had been dead 2 years. Long enough for the ache to go quiet. Not gone. Just quiet. Like a coal buried under ash, still hot if you dug down far enough. Addie tried never to dig. Her father was different now. That was the plain truth of it, and plain truth was the only kind Addie had time for these days. Emmett Foster used to laugh loud enough to rattle the windows. Used to swing her up, onto the counter, when she was a girl, and let her ring up customers herself, pretending she was already a grown woman running the place, and he'd wink at whoever was buying flour like the two of them were in on a joke the customer would never quite understand. Now he came home late. Smelling of whiskey and smoke and something else. Something like fear, though she couldn't have said why fear had a smell, except that it did, and she'd learned it the way a person learns the smell of a storm, before the sky even changes color. Because grief does something to a man. Because it hollows him out first, quiet, patient, the way water hollows stone. And then something else moves in to fill the space. Something greedier. Because that something else, in her father's case, had a name. Cards. She heard the dice sometimes, in her sleep, even when he wasn't home. That soft clatter. Like small bones falling. She'd wake with her jaw clenched, and her hands in fists under the quilt, and she'd lie there in the dark telling herself it was only a dream, until the morning she realized it wasn't a dream at all. It was memory. Her body remembering sounds her mind wanted to forget. The debts had started small. A few dollars here. A sold mule there. Addie hadn't worried, not at first, because men gambled, men always had. Her own grandfather had lost a horse to a poker hand once, and lived to tell it, as a joke at supper for 30 years, laughing every single time like it got funnier, with age instead of staler. Except this wasn't that. This kept growing. Kept climbing, like something with a mind of its own, like it wanted to eat the whole store, the roof over their heads, the land under their boots, and leave nothing behind, but a signature on a piece of paper, and a family too proud to admit how far they'd already fallen. And Addie had started to notice things. Small things. The way the same 3 men kept coming, through Marrow Flat to play cards, with her father. The way they always seemed to know exactly, when Emmett had a little money to lose, arriving like vultures who'd learned to read the wind. The way one of them, a lean man, with a gambler's smile, and a silver ring on his little finger, always seemed to be the one dealing, when the pot got big enough to matter. She didn't have proof. Not yet. Just a feeling, that sat cold in her stomach every time she thought about it, a feeling that wouldn't let her sleep some nights, turning over and over behind her ribs like a stone rattling in a jar. A feeling that said, this isn't bad luck. This is a trap. Somebody built it, careful, patient, brick by brick. Somebody's watching it close, waiting for the walls to finish rising, before they spring shut. That day the desert heat came up early, shimmering off the flats like the whole world had gone underwater, and Addie was elbow-deep in the coffee tins, straightening what didn't need straightening, because her hands needed the lie of purpose, when the door slammed open, so hard the bell over it screamed. Her father. Face red. Hat crooked. Hands not steady. Addie. Pa. Put on your mother's shawl. She stopped. Rag still in her fist. Something in his voice had gone strange, high and thin, like a man walking a ledge he couldn't see the bottom of. Why? We've got company. Company. Out here. That word didn't belong in this place, not really, not unless it came riding in on trouble, and something in her chest folded up small, and hard like a fist closing around a stone. She went to the window, because she had to see it for herself. Because some part of her already knew, the way a body knows a storm is coming, before the clouds ever show, and she wanted the confirmation more than she wanted the comfort of not knowing yet. A man on a painted horse. Coming slow. Unhurried in a way that made her skin prickle, because men who came unhurried were men who already knew they'd get what they came for. Men in a hurry were still fighting for something. This man had already won whatever he'd ridden out to claim, and the slowness of him said, so plain as any words could. He swung down off the horse like it cost him nothing. Tall. Broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who'd worked for everything he had, not the soft kind of broad, that came from sitting behind a desk counting other men's money. His hair was long, bound back simple. His skin dark, from years under this same brutal sun, that had baked Addie's own arms brown despite the shawl, despite the bonnet, despite every effort her mother used to make her take against freckling, back when her mother was still alive to fuss over such small useless things. Apache. She knew that much, from the cut of his clothes, from the quiet certainty in how he moved, like a man who'd learned long ago, that the desert didn't reward hurry, only patience, only the kind of stillness that let a person hear trouble coming, from a long way off. His name's Chogan, her father muttered, turning his hat in his hands like a man confessing to a preacher he'd already disappointed too many times to count. Here to do business. Business. Addie said nothing. She'd learned that word from her father before. Business had meant the mule. Business had meant the good rifle, gone in a single bad hand, traded away like it had never mattered at all. She was starting to hate that word the way some folks hated snakes, the way her stomach dropped a little every time it left her father's mouth, because it never once, not one single time, had meant anything good. The stranger, Chogan, ducked his head under the low doorway, when he came in, and the room seemed to shrink around him, not because he was trying to fill it, but because he simply did, the way a mountain fills a horizon whether it means to or not, whether anybody standing in its shadow gave it permission or not. I come for the trade, he said. Even words. Careful, like each one had been chosen, and weighed before it left him, the way a man weighs coins, before he spends them. Her father nodded too fast. A fair one. I promise you that. His voice cracked a little on promise, like the word cost him more than he had left to spend. Addie busied herself, with the coffee jars again, rearranging what was already arranged, straining to hear, because listening was the only power left to her in a room where two men decided things, over her head like she was furniture. Debt. Land. Agreement. Words drifting to her like smoke, through a cracked window, and each one landed heavier than the last, until her father turned to her, and something in his face had already given up, before he even opened his mouth. She watched him swallow. Watched his throat work. Watched a man she used to love, without complication brace himself to say something he already knew would break something between them, that couldn't be mended cheap. Addie. He cleared his throat like there was something stuck there he couldn't shift, no matter how hard he tried. You'll be going with Mr. Chogan. Come morning. The rag slipped out of her hand. Going where? With him. With him, she repeated, because her mind wouldn't move past those two words, wouldn't let them mean what they seemed to mean. Because surely her own father, whatever else he'd become these past 2 years, hadn't just said what she thought he'd said. Because that would mean. He's agreed to marry you, her father said, all in a rush now, like if he said it fast enough it wouldn't sound as ugly, like speed alone could soften the shape of the thing. In exchange, he clears what I owe. The room tilted. Because that was the only word for it. Tilted. Like the floor had come loose, from the earth, and she was standing on something, that could no longer be trusted to hold her weight. Like the whole store, the shelves, the counter she'd wiped down 3 times, that morning for no reason at all, had all decided at once to lean. You sold me. Her voice came out flatter than she expected. Flatter than the fury underneath it deserved, though the fury was there, building fast, a fire catching in dry brush. It ain't like that. Her father's jaw worked, stubborn even now, even caught red-handed, with his own daughter's future folded up in his pocket like a losing hand he was still trying to bluff his way out of. He's a good man. Quiet. Got land. Stock. Better than what I can give you here. Better? The word cracked out of her, loud enough that Chogan's dark eyes shifted to her for the first time, steady, unreadable, and she hated that too, hated being looked at like a line item being settled, like a debt, with a face attached. You're trading your own daughter to a stranger to cover a card debt, and you call that better? Emmett didn't answer. He turned instead, and poured himself a drink, the same old cowardice dressed up, as calm, the same retreat he always made whenever the truth of himself got too loud to stand in the same room with. And something in Addie went cold, and clear, the fury burning down fast, into something harder, something with edges. Because she was 24. Not a child to be handed over like a sack of grain, not some girl too young to understand what was happening to her. She understood exactly what was happening. That was the trouble. Understanding it didn't make it hurt less. If anything, it made the hurt sharper, because there was no fog of confusion to hide behind, only the plain, ugly shape of the thing, staring her right in the face. She turned to the stranger, chin up, voice steady even, though her hands were shaking behind her back, where he couldn't see them. I'm not some prize to be handed over, she said. Whatever agreement my father thinks he's made, it isn't mine. I won't be told who I marry like I'm a horse changing hands. Chogan studied her for a long moment. Not with anger. Not with the amusement she half expected, half braced for, the look men sometimes got, when a woman spoke too plain for their comfort, that little curl at the corner of the mouth, that said isn't that cute, she thinks she has a say. None of that. I did not come to take what is not given, he said finally. Your father offered. I have not accepted a woman. I have offered a bargain. The choosing is still yours to make. That stopped her. Because she'd expected a man, who bought and sold like her father did, careless, hungry, blind to the wreckage he left behind. Not this. Not a man, who put the choice back in her hands like it had never left them, like he understood, in some way she couldn't, yet name, exactly what it cost a person to have their life decided by someone else's mistakes. And if I say no? Then I ride home, he said simply. And your father's debt is his own to carry. Silence spread through the room like spilled water, finding every crack, every gap between the floorboards, every place where words might have gone, if anyone had dared speak them. Her father wouldn't meet her eyes. He never did, not when it mattered, not when the truth of him was standing right there in the open for anyone to see, laid bare under lamplight, with nowhere left to hide. Addie looked at the stranger a long moment. At the stillness in him. At the way he stood like a man, who had already survived worse than this room, worse than her father's mess, worse than whatever judgment she was about to hand down on a morning that had started, just hours before, like any other morning of her narrowing, careful life. I need to understand what I'm agreeing to, she said. Before I decide anything. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite surprise. Something closer to respect. Then I will tell you, he said. All of it. They didn't talk that night. Not really. Not the kind of talking that mattered. Her father went to bed early, which was its own kind of confession, a man too ashamed to sit up and face what he'd done, retreating to the dark rather than answer for it in the light. Chogan took a room at the boarding house down the flat, said he'd return at first light for her answer, and left Addie alone, with the ledger book her father kept behind the counter. She read it by lamplight, until her eyes burned. Because something about the numbers didn't sit right. The debts climbed too fast. Too even. Like a hand guiding them upward instead of chance, instead of the ordinary blind cruelty of bad luck. She found the same name threading, through half the transactions, tucked in as a witness, a lender, a silent partner in 3 different deals, that should never have connected, should have stood, as far apart, from each other, as 3 separate lives. Cormac Vane. She didn't know the name. Not yet. But she wrote it down on a scrap of paper, and folded it, into her sleeve like evidence, because something in her gut said this mattered, said this was the shape of the trap closing around her father, around this whole flat, and she meant to understand it, before she signed her name to anything, before she let anyone decide her life for her one more time, without a fight. Which meant she barely slept. Because every time she closed her eyes she saw the ledger's careful, patient numbers, climbing and climbing like a fever chart, like a man's whole life narrowing down to a single crushing point. Until the gray light came up, over the ridge, and she heard hooves outside, slow and unhurried again, and she knew, before she looked, that he'd come back exactly, when he said he would. Exactly when he said. Not before, testing her patience. Not after, testing her fear. Exactly when. She met him on the porch. Coffee in hand. Steadier than she felt. You said you'd tell me everything, she said. So tell me. Chogan dismounted. Didn't rush it. Everything about the man moved like he had all the time in the world, even when the world around him was on fire. Your father's debt, he said, is not only cards. Cormac Vane has been buying up water rights along the flat for 2 years. Quiet. Through other men's names, so no one sees his hand in it. Your father's land sits, over the last spring, that isn't yet his. Addie's stomach dropped. You're saying my father was set up. I am saying, Chogan said carefully, that a man, who wants land does not always ride in, with a gun. Sometimes he sends cards. And a smile. And patience. And waits for a grieving man to hand him everything, without ever once raising his voice. And you know this how? Because Vane tried the same on my land 3 winters past, Chogan said, and something flickered behind his eyes, brief, gone before she could name it. I did not lose. He has not forgiven that. Addie stood with that a moment. Turning it over. Because it changed things. Because if this wasn't just her father's foolishness, if there was a man behind the curtain pulling threads, careful and patient, as a spider building its web one strand at a time, then walking away from this bargain didn't just mean her father lost the store. It meant Vane won. Whatever winning meant to a man like that. Whatever hunger sat behind eyes that never showed themselves, hiding instead behind other men's names, other men's ruin. Why marriage, she said finally. Why not just pay the debt, and be done with it? Why does it have to be this? Chogan was quiet a moment, like he was deciding how much truth to hand her at once, weighing it the way he'd weighed his first words to her father. Territory law, he said. Land held by a native man can be broken apart by any court that decides to call it unclaimed, or contested, or simply inconvenient. Vane has done this before, to others. Men who worked land for 20 years, gone in a single afternoon, because a judge somewhere decided the paperwork was untidy. But land held, through a lawful marriage, recognized by the territory, cannot be touched so easy. A wife. A household. A name in a courthouse book. It becomes harder to erase. So I'm not a bride, Addie said slowly. I'm a wall. You are whatever you choose to be, Chogan said. But yes. A marriage between us closes a door that has stood open too long. It protects what is mine. And it clears what your father owes, which protects what is yours. Addie looked out at the flat. At the heat already starting to shimmer off the ground, though the sun had barely cleared the ridge. At the whole flat, dry and stubborn, and hers in some deep unspoken way she'd never examined too closely, because it was the only place she'd ever known, the only ground her mother's bones had ever walked, before they went still under the little cemetery on the hill. Because here was the truth of it, plain as her father's cowardice, plain as her mother's absence, plain as the 2 years of quiet grief that had brought her to this porch at all. She had nothing waiting for her here except more of the same. More debts. More strangers with silver rings and patient smiles. More watching her father drink himself smaller every year, until there was nothing left of the man, who used to swing her, onto the counter, and let her play shopkeeper, laughing like the whole world was still simple and good. She could refuse. She could refuse, and lose everything anyway, just slower. Watch the store go. Watch her father go, with it, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to bury, but a name on a stone. Or she could choose this. Walk into it, with her eyes open, not because a man had bought her, but because she'd looked at the ledger herself, and understood the trap herself, and decided for herself, that this was the one door still worth walking through. If I do this, she said, it's my choice. Not my father's. Not yours. Mine. I would not want it any other way, Chogan said. And if it doesn't work? If we can't, if this doesn't become something real between us? Then you will still have land in your name, he said. And a way out, should you want it. I do not buy silence, Miss Foster. I do not buy a wife the way a man buys a horse. I am offering a bargain that protects us both. What grows from it, or does not, that is not mine to decide alone. Addie set her coffee cup down on the porch rail. Hands steadier now than they'd been all night. Then I accept, she said. Not for him. She glanced back at the store, at the shape of her father moving behind the curtain, pretending not to listen. For myself. And because I intend to see Cormac Vane answer for what he's done to this flat, one way or another. Something almost like a smile touched the corner of Chogan's mouth. Gone as quick as it came. Then we understand each other, he said. There is a circuit judge passing through the territory this season. He will reach Red Hill country within the week. We will make this lawful, before him, in front of witnesses, so no court can ever call it anything but what it is. Until then, pack what you need. We ride within the hour. She packed light. Her mother's shawl, blue as a winter sky, worn soft from years of use. A Bible she didn't open often, but couldn't leave behind. A small silver locket, the clasp worn smooth, from thumbing it open and shut too many times, over 2 years of grief. And the folded scrap of paper, with Cormac Vane's name written on it, tucked deep in her sleeve, where no one would think to look. Her father didn't come out to see her off. She waited. Stood by the door a long moment, half hoping he'd come stumbling out, half hoping he'd stop this whole thing, tell her he'd found another way, tell her he was sorry in a way that meant something more than a bottle emptied in the dark. He didn't. The silence stretched, until it became its own kind of answer. So she lifted her chin, tied the shawl at her shoulders, and walked out to where Chogan stood waiting, with 2 saddled horses, the morning sun already climbing hot and merciless over the ridge. He offered his hand to help her mount. She ignored it. Swung up herself, though her legs weren't quite steady doing it. If he was offended, he didn't show it. Just swung up, onto his own horse, and turned toward the horizon, toward the red hills rising faint and distant beyond the flat. "You don't have to make this easy," he said, not looking at her. "But you'll make it harder on yourself, fighting everything before it's earned your fight." "I'll decide what's earned my fight," she said. "Once I see it clear." That, at least, seemed to satisfy him. He said nothing more. Just nudged his horse forward, and after a moment, she followed. They rode in silence most of the first hour. The land stretched out around them, endless and indifferent, crimson earth cracked by sun, stony ridges rising, and falling like the breathing of something ancient and half asleep. A hawk cried somewhere overhead, and Addie's whole body ached already, from a saddle she wasn't used to, and her mind wouldn't stop circling. Because how had this become her life? How had 2 years slid by, so fast, grief to gambling to this stranger, this ride into country she didn't know, toward a home that wasn't hers yet, toward a man she'd have to learn to trust, or else spend the rest of her days regretting a choice made in a single desperate morning. Except there'd been something in the way he'd said the choosing is still yours to make. Something that had cracked the door open on a different kind of fear. Not fear of him. Fear of hoping he meant it. Because hope, Addie had learned these past 2 years, was a dangerous thing to carry too openly. Hope was a door left unlocked, and she'd had enough men walk through it and take what they wanted, leaving the hinges creaking behind them. She caught herself watching him, when he wasn't looking. The set of his jaw. The way his eyes moved constantly, over the land, reading it the way her father used to read a ledger, alert to every shift in the wind, every distant dust cloud, that might be nothing, might be trouble. At midday they stopped near a dry creek bed, more gully than water now, the spring runoff long gone to dust. Chogan swung down, filled a canteen, from the water he carried, and held it out to her. "Drink." She took it. Didn't say thank you, not yet, not until she'd decided how much gratitude this whole arrangement deserved. "Why," she said instead. "Why offer for me at all? You could have paid off his debt, and walked away clean. Why tie yourself to a woman you don't know, in a marriage, that might never be more than paper?" Chogan crouched by the dead creek, turning a stone over in his hand. "Because Vane will keep pushing," he said. "At your father. At me. At anyone standing on land he wants. A debt paid quiet still leaves your father owing something. A marriage closes the account for good, in the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of men like Vane, who only understand what they can't undo." "That's a business reason," she said. "Not a real one." He looked up at her then, and something in his gaze made her chest go tight and strange. "I buried a wife 3 years past," he said, flat and quiet, no drama in it, just fact laid bare like stone. "I did not think to take another. But your father's debt crossed paths, with my land, and Vane's name was written, through both, and I decided, better to build something, with a woman, who fights for her own choices than to watch another piece of this territory fall, into his hands unclaimed." Addie absorbed that. Turned it over the way he'd turned the stone. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your wife." "Do not be sorry," he said. She is not why I offered. But she is why I understand what it costs a person to be handed to someone else's plans. They didn't speak much more that stop. But something had shifted, some small stone rolled aside, and when they mounted again, the silence between them felt less like a wall, and more like a held breath. By late afternoon the land had begun to change. The flat gave way to rising country, red stone ridges catching fire in the slanting light, cedar trees bent low by decades of wind. Addie had never seen land so wild. It should have frightened her more than it did. They made camp, as the sun dropped, Chogan building a fire, with quick economical movements, setting a pot to boil, while Addie sat a few feet off, arms wrapped around her knees, watching flame eat into the dusk. When the first coyote cried somewhere in the dark, she flinched despite herself. Chogan, whittling a stick by the fire, didn't look up. They won't come close. Fire keeps them off. I'm not afraid, she said, too fast. The corner of his mouth twitched. Just barely. Yes, he said. You are. She turned away, cheeks hot, furious at how easily he'd seen through her, furious at herself for letting it show. But later, when sleep finally dragged her under, she woke once in the deep dark to find him still sitting up, knife resting across his lap, eyes fixed on the horizon like he was standing guard against something she couldn't see. For a long moment she just watched him. Not a stranger. Not quite a captor, not anymore, though she wasn't ready, yet to call him anything gentler than that. A man carrying his own weight. His own ghosts. Same as her. Why me, she whispered, into the dark, not sure if she meant for him to hear it. He answered anyway, voice low, steady. Because I know what it costs, to have your life decided by someone else's debt. And because I would rather build something honest than watch Vane take one more piece of this land unopposed. She didn't have an answer for that. Just lay back, and listen to the fire crack, and settle, and something in her chest, some old tight knot of fear, loosened by half a turn. Morning came hard and bright. They rode most of that second day mostly quiet, though the quiet had changed texture, less brittle now, more like two people learning the shape of each other's silences. It was near mid-afternoon, when Shogun's horse went suddenly still, ears pricked, and he lifted a hand for her to stop. Riders, he said, low. 3 men came, over the ridge ahead, moving unhurried, the way men move, when they already believe they hold the advantage. Addie's stomach dropped, when she recognized the lean shape of the lead rider, silver ring catching the light even at this distance. The same man who'd been dealing cards in her father's store more times than coincidence should allow. That's one of Vane's men, she said quietly. I know, Chogan said. His voice hadn't changed, but something in the set of his shoulders had, some readiness settling, into him like a coat put on. The riders reined up a stone's throw off. The lean man tipped his hat, smile easy, eyes not. Chogan, he said. Didn't expect to see you riding with company. Business of my own, Hollis, Chogan said. Nothing that concerns Vane. Hollis's gaze slid to Addie, slow, appraising in a way that made her skin crawl. Foster's girl, ain't you? Heard your pa had himself some trouble at the tables. My father's trouble is settled, Addie said, chin up, refusing to let her voice shake. Whatever business you and Mr. Vane thought you had there, it's finished. Hollis's smile widened, but something behind it had gone cold. Finished. That's an interesting word. He looked at Chogan again. Mr. Vane's gonna want to hear about this. A marriage, is it? Real neat trick, using a woman to wall off land a court might otherwise call open. The land was never open, Chogan said, quiet and even. Only Vane's greed made it look that way. For a moment nobody moved. The wind pushed dust between them, and Addie held her breath, some old animal part of her certain this was the moment things went wrong, the moment a gun cleared a holster, and the whole fragile bargain came apart in blood, before it had even properly begun. Then Hollis laughed. Short. Ugly. You always did talk pretty for a man, with dirt under his nails, he said, and turned his horse. Enjoy your bride, Chogan. Mr. Vane'll be paying his respects soon enough. They rode off the way they'd come, unhurried, and it was only once they'd disappeared, over the ridge, that Addie let herself breathe again. That was a warning, she said. It was, Chogan agreed. Vane does not send men to talk, unless he means to send more, later, to do something worse. Then we should be ready for it. He looked at her then, something like surprise flickering behind his eyes, quickly folded away. You are not what I expected, Miss Foster. Good, she said. I'd hate to be predictable to a man I just met. That, finally, earned something close to a real smile. Small. There and gone. But real. They reached the edge of the Red Hill country, as the sun began its long fall toward evening, and Addie found herself, despite everything, catching her breath at the sight of it. The land had gone, from wild to something else entirely. Rolling ridges the color of dried blood, cedar trees bowing low, over narrow canyons, a stream cutting a silver line, through red rock and dust. It didn't look barren the way the flat had. It looked alive. Breathing. Home, Chogan said, nodding toward a distant cluster of cedars. Addie's throat tightened at the word. She wanted to argue it. Wanted to say it isn't my home, not yet, maybe not ever. But exhaustion had worn her down to something quieter than argument, some place past fear, past fury, into a kind of stunned acceptance, that felt almost like peace, if peace could taste like dust and fear all at once. They came down, through the cedar grove, as the light went gold, and the cabin rose up ahead of them, cedar logs and adobe, a small corral, 2 horses grazing easy in the last of the sun. Smoke curled thin, from the chimney, though no one had lit a fire, that day, which meant someone had been tending the place, while Chogan was gone. You have someone here, Addie said. My brother, Chogan said, something guarded coming, into his voice. Yiska. He will not be pleased about this. Before Addie could ask what he meant, the cabin door opened, and a younger man stepped out. Same steady build, as Chogan, same watchful eyes, though where Shogun's face had settled, into something calm, and unreadable, Yiska's was all sharp edges, and open suspicion. His gaze went, from Chogan to Addie, and back again, and whatever he saw there made his jaw tighten. You actually did it, he said, in English, clearly for her benefit, or maybe as an accusation aimed straight at his brother. You brought a white woman here. Like Josefa wasn't enough of a warning. The name landed in the air like a stone dropped, into still water. Shogun's face didn't change, but something in his stillness sharpened. Not now, Yiska. When, then? Yiska's eyes cut to Addie, not unkind exactly, but not welcoming either. Something closer to grief wearing the mask of anger. You don't know what you're riding into, Mississippi. You don't know what this land already took, from him once. Yiska. Shogun's voice dropped low, warning clear underneath it. The younger man held his brother's gaze a long moment. Then looked away first, jaw tight, and turned back toward the cabin, without another word, leaving the door open behind him like an unfinished argument. Addie sat her horse in the settling dusk, heart hammering, that single name, Josefa, ringing in her ears like a bell she couldn't unhear. Who was she? Addie said quietly. Your wife. Josefa. Chogan was quiet a long moment, staring toward the cabin, toward whatever ghosts lived inside it waiting for him. That is a story for another night, he said finally. Come. You have ridden far enough for one day. He swung down, offered his hand again. This time, exhausted, wary, and strangely unwilling to be alone, with her own thoughts a moment longer, Addie let him help her down. Her boots hit the ground. Her legs nearly buckled, from 2 days in the saddle. His hand steadied her at the elbow, brief, careful, gone the moment she found her footing. "Thank you," she said. First time she'd said it, since leaving Marrow Flat. Something eased, just slightly, in the line of his shoulders. "Come inside," he said. "Whatever comes next. It will keep until morning." She followed him toward the cabin, toward the smoke, and the lamplight, and the brother, who did not want her there, toward a name, Josefa, that she already knew, somehow, was going to matter more than anyone was ready to tell her. The circuit judge came, through Red Hill country 5 days later, an old, sun-weathered man named Prescott, who traveled the territory on a stubborn gray mule, and carried the whole weight of the law folded up in a leather satchel he never let out of his sight. Yiska stood witness, arms crossed, jaw tight the whole time, though he came all the same, because whatever grudge he carried against this marriage, he carried a deeper loyalty to his brother, that outweighed it. Sheriff Whitlock rode out too, at Chogan's quiet request, because a marriage witnessed by the law itself was a marriage no court could later pretend hadn't happened. Addie stood on the porch in her mother's blue shawl, the only finery she owned, and said her vows in a voice steadier than she'd expected, steadier than she felt, watching Chogan's face for some sign of what this moment meant to him beyond the paperwork, the protection, the careful architecture of a bargain built to withstand a storm neither of them could, yet fully see coming. With this, Judge Prescott said, closing his book, the territory recognizes this marriage, as lawful, in full, before God and witness. Chogan looked at her a long moment, after the words were spoken. Something unguarded, just for a heartbeat, moving behind his careful stillness. "Whatever comes now," he said quietly, "just for her, it will come to us both together. Not to you alone." Addie didn't know, standing there in the fading light, with a stranger's ring cool against her finger, how many times in the coming year she would need to remember he'd said that. But something in her chest, some old tight thing, loosened just enough to let her breathe a little easier walking back, into the cabin, that night, into a life she had chosen, with her eyes open, and still could not fully see the shape of. Behind her, the wind swept down off the ridge one more time, carrying dust and the last of the daylight, with it, and Addie Foster, Addie now, whatever else the law might call her, stepped across a threshold, into a marriage built on paper, and desperation and something else neither of them had, yet found the words for. Morning came to the Red Hills different than it came to the flat. Softer at the edges. Gold instead of white. The kind of light, that made a person forget, for one held breath, everything that had brought her here. Addie woke to the smell of wood smoke, and something bitter boiling, herbs maybe, and for a moment, just one, she forgot, where she was. Forgot the ledger. Forgot Vane. Forgot the ring on Hollis's finger, and the warning in his voice. Then she remembered. And the weight came back down on her chest like a dropped stone. Because that was how grief worked. That was how fear worked too. It let you forget just long enough to hurt worse, when it came flooding back. She sat up on the narrow cot in the smaller room, hers now, apparently, cedar log walls and a cracked mirror, and a vase of wildflowers someone had left there, before she arrived, wilted now, forgotten, and listened to the sounds of the cabin waking around her. Low voices outside. Chogan's steady murmur. Yiska's sharper one, cutting in. She couldn't make out words. Didn't need to. The tone told her enough. They were arguing about her. She didn't go out right away. Instead she sat on the edge of the cot, hands in her lap, and made herself breathe slow. In. Hold. Out. Because panic wouldn't help her here. Panic never had. Panic was for women, who could afford to fall apart, and Addie Foster had never once in her life been that kind of woman, not when her mother died, not when her father started drinking his grief into something meaner, not now, married 5 days to a man whose brother wanted her gone, before she'd even unpacked. So she stood. Smoothed her skirt. Walked out into the main room like she belonged there, chin up, because a woman, who looked like she belonged was harder to argue with than one, who looked like she was asking permission. The argument stopped the second she appeared. Yiska stood near the hearth, arms crossed, jaw tight as a fist. Chogan stood by the door, unreadable as ever, though something in his shoulders had gone rigid in a way she hadn't seen on the ride. "Morning," Addie said, into the silence, because someone had to say something. Yiska's eyes cut to her. Not cruel. Just guarded. The way a man looks at whether he doesn't trust. "There's coffee," he said finally. Grudging. "If you want it." "I want it," Addie said. He poured it, without another word, and set it on the table hard enough, that a little sloshed, over the rim. Addie sat. Wrapped both hands around the cup. Let the heat of it ground her. "You don't want me here," she said, because dancing around it felt like a waste of everyone's morning. "I understand that. I'd probably feel the same, in your boots." Yiska's eyebrows went up, just slightly. Surprised, maybe, that she'd said it plain instead of pretending not to notice. "It's not about wanting," he said. "It's about what happened last time." "Yiska." Shogun's voice, low, warning. "She's going to hear it eventually," Yiska said, not backing down. "Better from me than from gossip in town." Addie set her cup down. Looked between them. "Hear what?" Silence stretched. Because this was the moment, she realized. The hinge point. Whatever came next would either open a door, or slam one shut, and she was tired, so tired, of standing in rooms, where men decided what she was allowed to know. "Tell me," she said. "Whatever it is. I'd rather have it plain than feel it creeping up on me later." Shogun's jaw tightened. For a long moment she thought he'd refuse. Then he crossed the room. Sat across from her at the rough wooden table, hands folded, and when he spoke, his voice had gone quiet in a way that made the whole cabin feel smaller. "Her name was Josefa Reyes," he said. "She came from Tucson. Her father was killed in a raid, though not one of ours, men riding under no flag at all, using the trouble between settlers and Apache as cover for their own thieving. I found her after. Alone. No family left." Addie sat very still. Listening. "I married her the following spring," Chogan went on. "She lived here 5 years. Learned the land. Learned the herbs, the garden, the language a little, though her tongue never quite bent right around it. A ghost of something, not quite a smile, crossed his face and vanished. She said the wind here sang to her. Nobody believed her but me." "What happened?" Addie said softly. "Fever," Chogan said. "That is what the doctor in town called it. Fast. Sudden. 1 week she was strong. The next, gone. 3 years past this coming autumn." Yiska made a low sound in his throat. "Not agreement." "Tell her the rest," he said. Shogun's eyes flicked to his brother, something sharp passing between them, old argument worn smooth from repeating. "There is no rest to tell," Chogan said. "The doctor called it fever. I buried her under the cedar by the creek." "That is the whole of it." "That is what you tell yourself," Yiska said. "Because it's easier than the alternative." Yiska. "She got sick 2 days, after Vane's man came asking about the spring rites," Yiska pressed on, ignoring his brother now, eyes locked on Addie like he needed at least one person in this cabin to hear him plain. 2 days. And nobody else in this valley took fever that season. Not one other soul. Just her. The words landed in Addie's chest like ice water. "You think she was poisoned," she said slowly. "I think," Yiska said, "that Cormac Vane has wanted this land longer than either of us wants to admit, and I think a dead wife, with no family to ask questions was a very convenient kind of tragedy for a man like that." Yiska. Enough. Shogun's voice cracked, through the room like a dropped plate, sharper than Addie had heard from him yet, and for a moment the two brothers stared each other down across the small cabin, years of old grief, and older argument crackling in the space between them. Then Chogan stood. Walked to the door. Stood there with his back to both of them, shoulders squared against something Addie couldn't see. I have turned that thought over 100 times, he said, quiet now, all the sharpness bled out of him. In the dark. Alone. Wondering if I failed to see what was in front of me. He shook his head, once. But turning grief into suspicion does not bring her back. It only poisons what's left. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Because what was there to say? Grief didn't answer to logic. And suspicion, once it took root, didn't much care whether logic invited it in or not. Addie looked down at her coffee, cooling now, untouched. She thought of the ledger back in her father's store. Of Cormac Vane's name threaded quiet, through debts that shouldn't have connected. Of Hollis's cold smile on the ridge, and his warning, that Vane would be paying his respects soon enough. And she thought, this is bigger than a card game. This was never just a card game. I believe you, she said finally, looking up at Shogun's back. About the doctor. About the fever, as far as anyone could prove it that day. He turned. Something cautious in his eyes. But I also believe, she went on, that a man who'd fix a card game to steal a spring wouldn't think twice about worse things, if worse things got him what he wanted faster. Yiska's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. Vindicated, maybe, though there was no comfort in it. So what do we do, he said. Wait for him to come collect again? Wait and see who gets sick this time. No, Addie said, and something in her own voice surprised her, steady, certain, the voice of a woman who'd already decided something, without quite realizing it. We find proof. Real proof. Not suspicion. Not grief dressed up as evidence. Something a court, or a sheriff, or anybody with sense would have to believe. Chogan studied her a long moment. You sound like a woman, with a plan, he said. I sound, Addie said, like a woman who's done watching men decide her family's fate, over cards and quiet threats. If Vane wants this land, he's going to have to answer for what it's already cost. Starting with the truth about what happened to Josefa. Something passed over Shogun's face then. Grief, still. But underneath it, something else. Something that looked almost like gratitude. Then we start, he said, with her things. What's left of them? I never had the strength to go through it all. They went through it together that afternoon. A trunk, kept in the corner of Shogun's room, untouched since the burial, dust thick on the lid like a held breath finally let out. Addie's hands trembled a little, lifting the lid. Not from fear exactly. From the strange intimacy of it, touching a dead woman's belongings, a woman whose ghost had clearly never quite left this cabin, whose name alone had been enough to freeze a room. Dresses, folded careful. A rosary, beads worn smooth. A small tin box of letters in careful, looping Spanish that neither of them could fully read, though Chogan managed enough to know they were, from a cousin in Tucson, nothing urgent in them, nothing strange. And at the bottom, wrapped in a shawl gone stiff, with age, a small leather-bound book. A diary. Addie's breath caught. May I, she said, looking up at Chogan. He hesitated. Something raw moving behind his eyes. Then he nodded. Read it aloud, if you find something. I do not think I can hold the words alone. So she did. Most of it was ordinary. The kind of small daily record any woman might keep, out here where days blurred one, into the next, the garden, the weather, small jokes about Yiska's cooking, tender lines about Chogan, that made Addie's chest ache, with something like trespass, reading a love, that wasn't meant for her eyes. Until the entries near the end. The wind carried something today. Hollis rode past the fence line twice, though he had no cause to. Chogan says I worry too much. Perhaps I do. Addie's stomach tightened. A man came to the spring, while Chogan was away, with the herd. Said he was only watering his horse. I did not like the way he looked at the water. I did not drink from it after. There, Yiska said quietly, from where he'd sat down across the table, arms crossed, listening. There it is. Addie kept reading. I have not told Chogan how tired I have felt these past days. He worries enough already. I am sure it is only the heat. The final entry was shorter than the rest. The handwriting less steady. If something happens to me, I want him to know I do not regret this life. Whatever comes. I chose it. I would choose it again. Addie's throat closed. She set the diary down carefully, like it might break. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Because what was there to say, faced with a dead woman's last steady sentence, written maybe already sick, already afraid, and still choosing to leave behind not fear but gratitude. She knew, Yiska said finally, voice rough. She knew something was wrong, and she never told him. Because she didn't want to worry me, Chogan said, and his voice cracked, just slightly, just once, before he pulled it back under control. Same as I would not have told her. Addie looked at the two brothers. At the old grief between them, worn into the shape of an argument, because argument was easier to hold than sorrow. This isn't proof, she said gently. Not the kind that would stand up in a courtroom. But it's a thread. And threads, pulled careful, unravel whole coats. Chogan looked at her. Something steady settling back, into his face, grief folding itself down small enough to carry again. Then we pull it careful, he said. Together. Summer came on hard after that. The kind of heat, that pressed down on the valley like a hand, baking the red stone, until it shimmered, drying the stream to a silver thread winding, through cracked earth. Addie learned the rhythm of the days the way she'd once learned the rhythm of the store, out of necessity first, then, slowly, without her quite noticing the shift, out of something closer to belonging. She learned to grind corn. Learned which herbs Josefa had planted years back still came up wild along the fence line, and which ones needed coaxing. Learned to sit a horse properly, Shogun's voice patient beside her, you fight the reins, and the horse fights you, trust is earned, then let him earn it, until her hands stopped gripping, so hard and the animal beneath her stopped fighting back. Yiska thawed. Slowly. The way ice thaws in early spring, not all at once, but in small cracks, that widened without warning. It started with small things. A nod, instead of a glare, when she brought coffee out to, where he worked the fence. A grudging correction, when she mispronounced a word in Apache badly enough to make him wince. Not like that, he said, not unkind, just exact. Like this. And he said it again, slower, and she tried again, and he almost, smiled. You're stubborn, he told her one evening, watching her fail for the fourth time to get a knot right in a length of rope. I'll give you that. I've been told, Addie said, not looking up, from the knot. Chogan like stubborn, Yiska said. Quiet. Almost to himself. Josefa was stubborn too. Addie's hand stilled on the rope. Is that a warning, she asked carefully, or something else? Yiska was quiet a long moment, staring out at the ridge going gold in the last light. I don't know yet, he admitted. Ask me again in a season. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. But it was something. A door left unlocked, if not quite open. Between Chogan and Addie, something else was growing. Slower. Quieter. The kind of thing neither of them named out loud, because naming it felt like tempting fate, like inviting some old jealous god to notice, and take it away, before it had the chance to root. He taught her Apache words in the evenings, sitting by the fire, while Yiska pretended not to listen, from the porch. 2. For water. Shash, for bear. He pointed to the horizon one evening, the red stone catching the last of the light like a wound that never quite closed. Zil Lichii, he said. Red Mountain. She repeated it, badly, her tongue tripping over the sounds. Again, he said, patient. She tried again. Closer. Good, he said, and something in the way he said it made her chest go warm in a way she wasn't ready to examine too closely. You listen like someone who wants to belong. Maybe I do, she said, and was surprised to find it true. He told her stories some nights. Old ones, about spirits that guarded the wind, about animals that carried wisdom on their backs like packs. His voice went low, and steady telling them, the fire catching gold in his eyes, and Addie found herself leaning in, without meaning to, caught by a rhythm she didn't have words for yet. In return, she told him about her mother. The way she used to sing hymns, while kneading bread, flour dusting her wrists like snow. The smell of lavender, that had clung to her dresses long, after she stopped wearing them. He never interrupted. Just listened, firelight moving across his face, and something about being heard, that completely, without judgment, without impatience, cracked something open in Addie, that she hadn't realized she'd kept sealed shut, since her mother died. Because grief needed witnesses. She hadn't known that until she had one. The storm came, without warning, the way storms did out here, the sky going green-black in the space of an hour, wind turning sharp, and cold against skin still sunburned, from the day's heat. Addie was hauling in the drying herbs, when the first crack of thunder split the sky, and the younger mare, skittish, since Addie had first arrived, never quite settled, reared hard against her tether, and broke the corral post clean. Chogan. Addie shouted, but the wind ate her voice whole. She ran after the horse without thinking. Because that's what fear did, sometimes, it didn't freeze a person, it drove them, straight into the worst decision of the night. Mud sucked at her boots. Thorns caught her skirt. The mare's white eyes flashed ahead of her in the strobing lightning, panic driving the animal straight toward the ravine, that cut along the eastern edge of the property. Which was when Addie's foot slipped on wet stone. For one long, silent, terrible second, she felt the ground go out, from under her. Felt the edge of the ravine rushing up to meet her. Then a hand closed around her wrist. Hard. Sure. Chogan pulled her back, with a strength that left her breathless, hauled her against his chest, as the rain came down in sheets around them both, and for a moment neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. The horse can wait, he said quietly, into the storm, into her hair. You cannot. She looked up at him. Rain running down both their faces, lightning flickering silver along the ridge behind him, and something passed between them in that half second, that neither of them had words for. Something fierce. Human. Terrifying in how gently it had crept up on her. He released her slowly. Careful, like she might break, or like he might, if he held on a moment longer than the storm required. Thank you, she whispered. He didn't answer. Just nodded, once, and turned to check the fence line, and Addie stood there in the rain a moment longer than she needed to, hand pressed to her chest, heart hammering for reasons that had very little to do with the storm anymore. The days after that felt different. Charged, somehow. Like the air itself remembered the storm even after the sky had cleared. Addie caught herself humming, while she worked the garden, an old hymn her mother used to sing, and one afternoon she looked up to find Chogan had stopped mid-stride near the fence, listening, something soft moving behind his usually careful expression. He never said anything about it. But she noticed, after that, the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly whenever she started up again. Small things. Building, slow and careful, the way trust always did, when it was real. Then, in January, the trouble came riding up the ridge, and everything that had grown quiet, and careful between them got tested all at once. Addie saw the rider first, from the porch, a dark shape cresting the horizon, moving too fast for a friendly visit, moving with the particular urgency of a man riding toward a confrontation he'd already rehearsed in his head a dozen times. Her stomach dropped before she even recognized him. "Pa," she whispered. Chogan came out beside her, jaw tightening the moment he saw the shape of the horse, the two riders following behind, one wearing a badge, the other a wide-brimmed hat, and a pistol worn low and deliberate on his hip. Sheriff Whitlock. And Hollis. Emmett Foster dismounted, with a grunt, older-looking than the 2 seasons, since Addie had last seen him should have made him, his beard shot, through with more gray, his eyes carrying that same desperate fire she'd learned to fear, as a girl. "You come down here, girl," he said, voice rough. "We're going home." Chogan stepped forward, quiet and immovable, as the ridge behind him. "She has a home." "Don't talk to me," Emmett snapped, not even looking at him. "I didn't ride 2 days to hear from you." "Pa," Addie's voice came out sharper than she meant it. "What is this? Why are you here? Why is he here?" Her eyes cut to Hollis, standing easy near his horse, that same cold smile pulling at his mouth. "Your father's come to file a complaint," Sheriff Whitlock said, dismounting slower, brushing snow from his coat, with the careful boredom of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Says his daughter was taken against her will." "That's a lie," Addie said, fury cracking hot, through the cold in her chest. "He traded me for his debt. I didn't go willing. But I've stayed by my own choice, every day since, lawfully married before a circuit judge, and this very sheriff's own knowledge, and I'm not leaving now." Whitlock's brow lifted at that, some private confirmation settling into his face. Emmett's face twisted, some old shame curdling fast, into anger, the way it always did, when he got cornered. "You think you're something now," he said, voice rising. "Living out here playing house with." "Careful," Chogan said. "Quiet." But something underneath the word had gone very still, very dangerous. Emmett's jaw worked. He didn't finish the sentence. But everyone standing in the snow understood exactly what word he'd swallowed back. Addie stepped forward, chin high despite the cold biting, through her shawl. "I was 24 years old, when he handed me over to cover a card debt," she said, loud enough for the sheriff, for Hollis, for anyone standing close enough to hear. "Not 17. Not a child too foolish to understand what was happening. I understood exactly. And I chose, with my eyes open, to walk through that door instead of watching my father lose everything to a man who rigged the cards against him, from the start." The sheriff's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Rigged," he repeated. "Ask him," Addie said, nodding at Hollis, "how many hands he dealt my father, over the past year. Ask him how convenient it was, that every big loss came right, when my father had just enough to lose it." Hollis's easy smile didn't waver, but something went tight behind his eyes. "That's a mighty serious accusation," he said. "Awful light on proof." "For now," Addie said. Something in the way she said it made Hollis's jaw tick, just once. Emmett looked between them, something flickering across his face, that might have been doubt, might have been the first crack in whatever story he'd told himself to make peace with what he'd done. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered. "The deal, he wasn't supposed to keep you." "He didn't keep me," Addie said, voice cracking now, all the fury underneath finally breaking the surface. "I stayed. Because for the first time, since Mama died, somebody let me choose something for myself, instead of deciding it for me." "You never did that." "Not once." Emmett flinched like she'd struck him. The sheriff cleared his throat, uncomfortable, glancing between father and daughter like a man standing too close to a fire he hadn't started. Mrs. Chogan. You understand, given the complaint filed, I have to ask plain. Are you here of your own will?" I am, Addie said, steady now, every word deliberate. Married lawful, before Judge Prescott, with witnesses. And I'd like it entered, into whatever record you're keeping, Sheriff, that my father's debt was built on rigged games run by Cormac Vane's men, and that I intend to see that proven, one way or another. Whitlock's expression shifted, something more alert moving behind his tired eyes. Vane, he repeated. You've heard the name, Addie said. Not a question. I've heard a great many names, the sheriff said carefully. Some of them come, with more smoke than fire. Then let's find out, which kind this is, Addie said. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The wind cut, through the silence, carrying the cold deeper, into every gap in Addie's shawl. Emmett stared at his daughter like he was seeing her for the first time in years. Something moved behind his eyes, hurt, maybe, or the beginning of something, that might, someday, resemble shame doing honest work instead of hiding behind whiskey. I am home, Addie said quietly, echoing words she hadn't planned, but that rose up true, and certain the moment she needed them. Right here. This is my choice, pa, same as it was the day I made it. Emmett's mouth opened. Closed. Whatever he'd ridden 2 days to say seemed to have evaporated somewhere in the space of that single conversation. He climbed back, onto his horse, without another word. The sheriff tipped his hat toward Chogan, a small gesture, but a meaningful one, something like respect passing silent between two men, who understood exactly what had almost happened and hadn't. Hollis lingered a moment longer, eyes cutting once more to Addie, cold and assessing. You be careful, Mrs. Chogan, he said, voice pleasant in a way that made the words land uglier. Accusations cut both ways, out here. So does proof, Addie said. And I intend to find it. He smiled, thin and humorless, and turned his horse, without another word. When the three riders finally disappeared, over the ridge, the valley went quiet again, snow falling soft and steady, and Addie realized her whole body was shaking, adrenaline draining out of her all at once. Chogan turned to her. Jaw still tight. You should not have named Vane, so plain, he said. Quiet. Not quite scolding. Something closer to worry. Somebody had to, Addie said. And I'm done waiting for the right moment. There isn't one. There's just now, and later usually costs more. Something in Shogun's expression eased, slow, into something that looked almost like awe. You are braver than most men I have known, he said. Addie managed a tired, cold-cracked smile. And you're gentler than any I've ever met. He looked at her a long moment. Something raw moving behind his careful stillness. Gentle, he echoed softly. I do not know that word so well. Then let me teach you, she said. Neither of them moved. The snow kept falling, soft as ash, the fire glowing warm, through the cabin windows behind them, and for one suspended moment the whole cold world seemed to hold its breath around them both. Then he reached out. Brushed a snowflake, from her cheek, slow, careful, like she might startle and run. Maybe, he said, you have already begun. Spring came slow, that year, cautious, the snow retreating in patches, feeding the creek back to a proper voice again, the smell of new grass rolling sweet, over the red hills. But peace, Addie was learning, never lasted long out here. Not really. Not when a man like Cormac Vane still wanted what he wanted, and hadn't yet been made to answer for a single thing he'd taken. The trouble started small. The way trouble always did, testing the edges, before it came in swinging. A section of fence found down one morning, posts snapped clean, not by weather. 3 head of cattle missing by the following week, no tracks leading anywhere sensible, like they'd simply been herded off in the night by men, who knew exactly how to move quiet. Shogun's jaw tightened a little more each time. Yiska's suspicion, already sharpened by grief, honed itself into something colder, more watchful. It's starting again, Yiska said one evening, standing at the fence line, with his rifle across his shoulder, eyes on the darkening ridge. Same as before. Small things first. Testing how much we'll let slide, before we push back. Then we don't slide, Addie said. Yiska glanced at her, something almost like approval flickering across his face. You've got more fight in you than most folks I've met, white or otherwise. I've had practice, Addie said. Watching my father lose everything to men exactly like this. I don't intend to watch it happen twice. They rode into town together in late spring, Addie and Chogan both, to see Sheriff Whitlock about the missing cattle, about the fence, about the slow campaign of small cruelties, that all seemed to trace back, however carefully hidden, to Cormac Vane's men. The town hadn't warmed to the sight of them together. Whispers followed wherever they walked, some outright hostile, most simply curious in the ugly way curiosity sometimes wore. But something had shifted, too, in the months, since the confrontation, with her father. A few faces held something closer to respect than judgment. An old woman outside the mercantile nodded to Addie, quiet acknowledgement in her eyes. A shopkeeper's wife, who'd once refused to serve Chogan at all, now measured out his goods, without comment, without the sneer she used to wear doing it. Small things. But Addie noticed them, and something in her chest eased a little, seeing them. Sheriff Whitlock met them at his office, tired-eyed as ever, but something more alert in his posture than the last time they'd spoken. I've been looking into what you said, he told Addie, without preamble. About the games. About Vane. Addie's pulse quickened. And I've found enough smoke to make me nervous, Whitlock admitted. 3 other men in this county lost land, or livestock to debts, that trace back to games run by Vane's people. All within the last 2 years. All conveniently timed. That's a pattern, Chogan said. It's the start of one, Whitlock corrected. I need more than smoke to move against a man like Vane. He's got money enough to make most judges in this territory suddenly very forgetful. I need something nobody can argue away. Addie thought of the diary, still resting careful in the trunk back at the cabin. Of Josepha's quiet, chilling entries. Of a man watering his horse at a spring he had no cause to visit. I might have something, she said slowly. Not proof yet. But a thread. Whitlock's eyes sharpened. Then pull it. Careful. And bring me what you find. They rode home in the last gold light of evening, the words hanging heavy between them. If we push too hard, Chogan said finally, Vane will push back harder. He is not a man who loses gracefully. I know, Addie said. But if we don't push at all, he wins by default. And I've watched enough men win by default. I'm done letting that be how the story ends. Chogan glanced at her, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Pride, maybe. Fear, underneath it, carefully held. Josepha used to say something like that, he said quietly. About choosing to fight even, when the fighting frightened her more than losing did. Addie's chest tightened. I hope I get to keep proving her right about the company you keep. Something almost like a laugh escaped him, low and warm, gone as fast as it came. So do I, he said. The attack came 3 nights later, in the deep dark hour, before dawn, when the fire had burned down to embers, and the whole valley lay still under a sky thick with stars. Addie woke to the sound of hoofbeats. Wrong hoofbeats. Too many, too fast, moving with the particular urgency of men, who meant harm, and meant to be gone, before anyone could stop them. Because that was the sound trouble made, riding in the dark. Because a man with honest business didn't come at this hour, didn't come this fast, didn't. A shot cracked, through the night, and every thought in Addie's head scattered like startled birds. She was up, before she'd finished deciding to move, grabbing her shawl, heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her wrists, in the roots of her hair. Outside, chaos. Torches. 3, maybe 4 riders circling the corral, driving the horses, into a screaming panic, one already breaking free, and bolting into the dark. Yiska's voice, sharp and furious, somewhere near the barn. "Get down. Addie, get down." She dropped low, heart hammering, mind refusing to settle, into anything but raw animal fear. Because this was real now. Because whatever careful, cautious game Vane had been playing, with fences and missing cattle had just tipped over into something, with guns in it, something with fire in it, something that could kill. Chogan's shape moved, through the smoke, and torchlight, rifle raised, voice cutting through the chaos in a tone she'd never heard from him before, hard, commanding, every trace of his usual quiet stillness burned away by pure necessity. "Yiska. West fence. On it." Another shot. Closer this time. Addie flattened herself against the cabin wall, breath coming in short, useless gasps, and some distant clear-eyed part of her mind was already cataloguing details even, through the terror, 3 riders, maybe 4, faces covered, moving too practiced to be simple thugs hired off the street. Trained men. Vane's men. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was an attempt. The fight didn't last long. Couldn't, not against Chogan, and Yiska's combined fury, not against men, who knew every inch of this land better than any hired rider ever could. Within minutes the torches were scattering, retreating, hoofbeats fading back, into the dark the same way they'd come. But the damage was already done. The corral fence lay in splinters. 2 horses gone, driven off into the night, maybe lost for good in the dark canyon country beyond the ridge. And near the barn, in the sudden ringing silence, after the gunfire stopped, Yiska's voice cracked out, raw with something between fury and fear. "Chogan." Addie's stomach dropped straight, through the floor of the world. She ran toward the sound, toward the barn, toward the shape of Yiska kneeling in the churned mud, and found Chogan there, one hand pressed hard against his side, dark blood already soaking, through his shirt, spreading fast in the moonlight. "No," Addie breathed, dropping down beside him, hands hovering, useless, terrified. "No, no. I am fine," Chogan managed, though his voice had gone tight and thin, every word costing him something. "It grazed. Nothing more." "You're bleeding through your shirt," Addie said, voice cracking despite every effort to keep it steady. "That is not nothing." Yiska was already tearing strips, from his own shirt, hands moving fast, practiced, the panic in his face at odds, with the sureness of his hands. "Inside. Now. Before it gets worse." They half carried him, into the cabin, laid him on the narrow cot, and Addie's hands, shaking, clumsy with fear, pressed the makeshift bandage hard against the wound, while Yiska worked to clean it, both of them moving on instinct, because there was no time left for anything else. "You should not have come out there," Chogan said, through gritted teeth, eyes fixed on Addie even, as pain carved lines, into his face. "You could have been hit. And you could have bled out alone, if I hadn't," Addie shot back, voice fierce despite the tears standing hot in her eyes. "So don't. Don't you dare tell me to be safer, not after everything I've already chosen to risk." Something flickered behind his pain-tight eyes. Not argument. Something closer to helpless gratitude. Stubborn, he managed, the ghost of a smile pulling at his mouth despite everything. Josefa would have. He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Addie understood exactly what he meant, and the weight of it, being spoken of in the same breath, as a woman who died fighting the same silent war, settled heavy and strange in her chest. Yiska finished tying off the bandage, sat back on his heels, breathing hard, blood on his hands, not all of it his brother's, some of it, Addie realized with a fresh jolt of fear, was Yiska's own, a shallow cut along his forearm he hadn't, so much as mentioned. "This wasn't a warning," Yiska said, voice low and hard, staring at the blood-soaking, through the makeshift bandage. This was Vane deciding words weren't working fast enough. Then we go to Whitlock, Addie said. Tonight. Tomorrow, first light. Whatever proof we don't have yet, we make him understand this, can't wait for it. Chogan's hand found hers, weak but certain, fingers closing around her wrist the same way his hand had closed around it in the storm, months ago, the same steady grip that had pulled her back from the edge of the ravine. Careful, he murmured, eyes finally starting to lose their fight against exhaustion and blood loss. Careful, Addie. He will not stop at fences and cattle again. I know, she said, throat tight, blinking back tears she refused to let fall in front of him. I know. But neither will I. Outside, the last of the night's chaos settled into a fragile, exhausted quiet. The stars wheeled slow overhead, indifferent as ever to the small, furious, terrified courage of the people beneath them. And somewhere out past the ridge, in a house Addie had never seen, but could picture clear, as her own reflection, lamplit, comfortable, untouched by blood or fear, Cormac Vane was, she was certain, already planning what came next. She held Chogan's hand, until his breathing finally evened, into exhausted sleep, and stared into the dark beyond the window, and made herself a quiet, unshakable promise. Whatever Vane sent next, she would be ready for it. Because she had already given this land, this man, this fragile, hard-won piece far too much of herself to watch it taken now. And because some battles, she was learning, only ended one way. With somebody finally standing their ground, until the other side broke first. Chogan healed slow. Slower than he wanted. Slower than his pride could stand, though he never said so out loud, didn't have to. Addie watched it in the way he gripped the doorframe some mornings, jaw tight, refusing to let the pain show past the muscle working in his cheek. Because that was the kind of man he was. Because pain, to him, was just another thing to carry quiet, the way he carried grief, the way he carried Josepha's memory, the way he'd carried this whole valley on his back for longer than any one man should have to. 2 weeks. That's what it took, before he could ride again, without Yiska hovering at his elbow like a nervous hawk. 2 weeks of Addie changing bandages, with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere around the 4th day. 2 weeks of boiling water, grinding herbs Josepha had once planted, feeding a man broth he grumbled about, and ate anyway, because arguing cost him breath he didn't have to spare. 2 weeks of watching him get stronger. And 2 weeks of watching the valley get quieter in a way that didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting. The sickness came in late summer, the way sickness always seemed to come out here, sudden and cruel, and wearing a mask that looked, at first, like nothing worse than the heat. It started with the Alvarez boy, down near the creek crossing. Fever. Vomiting. A rash that spread fast across his small arms, and by the time his mother rode for the doctor in town, 3 more families had reported the same. Addie heard about it, from Yiska, who'd ridden into Marrow Flat for supplies, and come back grim-faced, jaw tight in that particular way, that meant trouble. Sick, he said, swinging down off his horse too fast, dust still hanging around him. All near the lower creek. Doctors calling it fever. Same word he used for. He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Addie's stomach dropped straight through the floor. Josepha, she said quietly. Josepha, Yiska confirmed. Chogan came out, onto the porch at the sound of raised voices, moving stiff but steady now, and something in his face went very still, when he heard it. The lower creek, he said. That runs from the same spring Vane's been circling for years. Because it clicked then. All of it. Clicked together so fast, and so ugly, that Addie felt sick, with the sudden, ice-cold shape of it. Because a poison spring wouldn't just take one wife, quiet, unnoticed, easy to explain away, as fever and grief. A poison spring, timed right, could empty out an entire valley of settlers desperate enough, frightened enough, exhausted enough to sell cheap and run. He's not trying to scare people off the land anymore, Addie said slowly, horror climbing up her throat word by word. He's trying to make the land itself the weapon. Shogun's jaw tightened, until she could see the muscle jump. Then we go to the spring, he said. Now. They rode hard, the three of them, sun hammering down like judgment, and found what Addie had half feared, and half refused to let herself imagine. A dead animal near the spring's edge. Bloated. Wrong. And near it, half buried, careless in the way men get careless, when they think no one's watching close enough to find what they leave behind, a small clay jar, cracked, its bitter residue still staining the rocks around the water's edge. Yiska crouched low, studied it without touching, face going pale under his sun-browned skin. That's not natural, he said. That's deliberate. Addie's hands curled into fists at her sides. Because there it was. Because 2 years of grief, of whispered fever, of a dead woman's diary entries about men watering horses at springs they had no cause to visit, none of it had been paranoia. None of it had been grief twisting itself into suspicion. It had been exactly what it looked like. Murder. Dressed up patient and slow as bad luck. We take this to Whitlock, Addie said, voice shaking with fury now instead of fear. Today. This is proof, Chogan. This is finally proof. Chogan didn't answer right away. He was staring at the water. At the dead animal. At 3 years of grief suddenly given a shape uglier than anything his imagination had dared build. 3 years, he said, voice low, rough. 3 years I told myself it was only fever. That turning grief into suspicion did nothing, but poison what was left. You didn't have proof, Addie said gently. Now we do. Except proof, Addie was learning fast, moved slower than sickness did. By the time Whitlock rode out himself, jar in hand, expression grim as a closed coffin, for more families had fallen ill. The Alvarez boys' fever had spiked dangerous in the night. An old rancher 2 farms over hadn't woken at all. And Chogan, steady, stubborn, still not fully healed, from a bullet wound 2 weeks old, had been drinking, from that same creek every morning, without either of them realizing it, filling canteens from the lower crossing out of pure habit, the same habit that had killed his first wife 3 years back, a coincidence so cruel it seemed almost designed. Addie realized at the moment his hand started shaking over supper. Because his color had gone wrong. Because the sweat on his brow had nothing to do with the evening heat. Because she'd seen this exact pattern before, in Josefa's diary, in careful looping handwriting, that had documented her own death one quiet entry at a time. Chogan. He looked up. Tried to smile. Failed. I am fine, he said, the same lie Josefa had probably told him 100 times, right up until she wasn't fine at all. You are not fine, Addie said, already moving, already reaching for the herbs she'd learned this past year, hands steady now in a crisis the way they hadn't been steady the first week she'd arrived. Yiska. Get water boiling. Now. Yiska didn't argue. Just moved, fast, the two of them working in the kind of silent, practiced rhythm that only came from months of learning each other's hands. Shogun's fever climbed through the night. By morning he was barely lucid, muttering things in Apache that Addie couldn't follow, skin burning under her palms no matter how many cool cloths she pressed to his forehead. Because this was it. This was the exact nightmare that had already claimed one wife in this cabin, and Addie be damned if she'd let it claim a second. You are not leaving me, she whispered to him, fierce, low, her hand wrapped tight around his. Do you hear me? You are not leaving me the way you lost her. I won't allow it. He didn't answer. Couldn't. But his fingers, weak as they were, tightened around hers, and Addie held on like, that grip was the only thing keeping either of them tethered to the world. She didn't sleep for 3 days. Because sleep felt like surrender, and surrender wasn't a language Addie Foster had ever learned to speak fluently. She remembered every herb Josefa's garden still grew wild along the fence line. Remembered the diary entries about willow bark for fever, about the bitter tea Josefa used to brew for the children in town, before her own sickness took her too fast to save herself. She rode into Marrow Flat herself on the second day, exhausted, filthy, past caring what the town thought of a white woman married to an Apache man riding in like a woman possessed, and found the doctor's office overwhelmed, 6 patients laid out on cots, families weeping in the hallway. "I need willow bark," she told the doctor, a tired, overworked man named Hargrove, who looked like he hadn't slept in longer than she had. "And whatever else you've got for fever. I don't care what it costs." "Everyone in this town needs the same," Hargrove said, exhausted. "I'm running short on everything." "Then let me help," Addie said. "I know herbs. I know fever. I've been tending it myself these past 3 days." Hargrove studied her a long moment. Something in her face, desperate, certain, unwilling to be turned away, seemed to convince him faster than any argument could have. "All right," he said. "God knows I need the hands." What happened next, Addie would only half remember clearly afterward, the days blurring together, into one long fever-bright stretch of boiling water, and cool cloths, and willow bark tea forced past cracked lips. She moved between the doctor's office, and her own cabin, back and forth, teaching Yiska what she learned, learning from Hargrove what she didn't already know, and somewhere in the exhausted middle of it, something shifted in Marrow Flat, that she wouldn't fully understand until later. Because the town watched her. Watched the woman who'd married an Apache man ride herself ragged saving white children she'd never met. Watched her sit, through the night, with old widow Callahan, spooning broth past lips too weak to hold a cup. Watched her hands, steady and sure, doing the same desperate work for strangers, that she'd been doing for her own husband, without once drawing a line between, who deserved saving, and who didn't. Small things, changing slow. The way old suspicion sometimes gives way, grudging and quiet, to something closer to respect. By the 4th day, Chogan's fever broke. Addie was asleep in the chair beside his cot, when it happened, exhaustion finally winning out, over vigilance, and she woke to the feel of his hand, cool now, steady now, resting light against her hair. "You came back," she whispered, tears she'd held back for 4 straight days finally breaking loose all at once. "I heard you," he said, voice rough but clear. "Telling me I wasn't allowed to leave. I did not think it wise to argue." She laughed, half sob, half real laughter, and pressed her forehead to his hand, and let herself, finally, fall apart for exactly, as long as it took to feel whole again. But the reprieve didn't last. Because Cormac Vane, watching his poisoned spring fail to empty the valley the way he'd planned, watching a stubborn Apache rancher, and his white wife somehow turn near disaster, into the beginning of the town's grudging respect, a man like, that didn't retreat. He escalated. The word came first, from Whitlock, riding out hard 3 days, after Chogan's fever broke, face grim in a way Addie hadn't seen on him before. "Vane's hired more men," he said, without dismounting. "A dozen, maybe more. Word in town is he means to settle this land dispute himself, court be damned, before my investigation goes any further." "Settle it how?" Chogan asked, though something in his voice said he already knew the answer. "However men like, that usually settle things," Whitlock said grimly. "I've sent for the territorial marshal. But that's 4 days out, minimum. You'd be wise to be ready before then." 4 days. Addie's mind raced through everything they didn't have. Enough men. Enough guns. Enough time. "Then we make 4 days count," she said. They spent those 4 days preparing the way people prepare, when preparation is the only thing standing between them and disaster. Yiska rode to 2 neighboring ranches, men who'd lost cattle to the same slow campaign of cruelty, men who'd watched their own children sicken, from that same poisoned spring, and came back not, with an army, but with 6 hard-eyed ranchers willing to stand a line, if it came to that. Chogan, still weak but refusing to stay abed, oversaw the reinforcement of the cabin itself, shutters reinforced, a second line of defense dug in near the barn, every window given a clear line of sight to the approach. And Addie wrote letters. To the territorial governor's office. To a newspaper editor in Santa Fe she'd heard of, through Hargrove, a man known for exposing exactly this kind of quiet frontier corruption. She wrote out everything, the rigged card games, the poisoned spring, Josefa's diary entries, the missing cattle, the night raid, that had nearly killed Chogan. Because paper outlived men. Because if this went the way she feared it might, she wanted the truth written down somewhere. Vane's money couldn't quietly make it disappear. She was sealing the last letter, when hoofbeats sounded on the ridge, fast, urgent, and her heart clawed up, into her throat, before she even recognized the rider. Her father. Emmett Foster rode into the yard looking like a man who hadn't slept in days, hat gone, coat torn, a fresh cut along his jaw still losing thin. Addie. He half fell off his horse, staggering toward her. Addie, thank God, I thought. Pa, what happened to you? Vane's men, he said, breathless, terrified in a way she'd never once seen her father look, not even at his worst. They came to the store. Wanted to know what I'd told the sheriff. Wanted to know if I'd talked. Addie's blood went cold. Did you? No, Emmett said, and something in his voice cracked wide open, 2 years of cowardice finally splitting apart under the weight of real fear, real consequence. No, I hadn't said a word, not till they threatened to burn the store down around me. And then he stopped. Swallowed hard. I told them everything I knew. About the games. About the water rights. I had ledgers, Addie. Proof. Vane's own man's handwriting in half of it. You have proof, Addie repeated, stunned. I've been keeping it, Emmett said, hands shaking as he pulled a bundle of papers from inside his torn coat, since before you left. Told myself I was gathering it to protect myself. Truth is, his voice broke. Truth is, I think some part of me always meant to give it to you, someday, when I finally worked up the nerve to be the father I should have been, from the start. Addie stared at the papers. At her father, disheveled and terrified, and finally honest. Why now, she said quietly. Why bring this now? Because Vane's men are riding for this valley tonight, Emmett said. I heard them say it plain, before I ran. Tonight, Addie. They mean to burn you out. Make it look like an accident. Same as they made Josefa's death look like fever. The name landed heavy in the yard, and behind her, Addie heard Chogan go very still. You knew, Chogan said, voice dangerously quiet. About Josefa. Emmett flinched, but didn't look away. I suspected. Same as your brother did. I was too much a coward to say it out loud, back when it might have mattered. He looked at Addie, eyes wet, ruined. I'm not brave, girl. Never have been. But I'll be damned, if I let you pay for my cowardice twice. Addie's throat closed around a dozen things she wanted to say, anger, still simmering after 2 years of neglect, and underneath it, something that felt dangerously close to forgiveness, arriving far too fast for a heart still learning to trust him again. Then help us, she said finally. Tonight. Prove it wasn't just words. Emmett nodded, wiping his face, with the back of a shaking hand. Tell me where you need me, he said. Night fell heavy, and starless, clouds rolling in low off the western ridge, and the whole valley seemed to hold its breath waiting for what was coming. They didn't have to wait long. Torches first, a dozen of them, cresting the ridge just past midnight, and Addie's heart slammed hard enough to hurt, as she took her position at the cabin window, rifle in hands, that had learned, this past year, not to shake, when it mattered most. Chogan stood at the door, still weak but immovable, rifle steady despite everything his body had survived these past weeks. Yiska and the 6 ranchers held the barn line. Emmett, to Addie's surprise, had taken a position near the corral, without being asked twice, jaw set with a determination she hadn't seen on his face since before her mother died. Cormac Vane rode at the front of his men, and Addie got her first real look at him then, not the shadow of a name scrawled through a ledger, but a real man, silver-haired, well-dressed even out here, face carrying none of the desperation of a man losing, only the cold calm of a man who'd simply decided losing wasn't an option he intended to consider. Chogan, Vane called out, easy, almost pleasant, like he was greeting a neighbor, over a fence line instead of riding in, with a dozen armed men behind him. I'd hoped this could be settled simpler. But you've made that difficult, you and your wife, stirring up questions best left buried. Some questions don't stay buried, Addie called back, voice steadier than she felt. Not even for a man with your money. Vane's eyes found her at the window, something cold and assessing moving behind them. Mrs. Chogan. His smile didn't reach his eyes. You should have stayed behind your father's counter. Would have saved everyone a great deal of trouble. You mean it would have saved you the trouble of answering for what you did to Josefa Reyes, Addie shot back. For what you tried to do to this whole valley, with a poison spring. Something flickered across Vane's face. Not guilt. Irritation, at being named, so plain, at having his quiet cruelty dragged into the open, where it couldn't hide behind convenient words like fever and bad luck. Careful, he said, voice losing its pleasant edge. Accusations like that, out here, tend to get the accuser buried right alongside the truth. Not this time, Emmett's voice rang out, unexpected, cutting through the tension like a blade. Addie's father stepped forward, from the corral, papers held high despite the torchlight flickering dangerous across the yard. I've got your man's own ledgers, Vane. Names. Dates. Every rigged hand, every dollar moved to buy up water rights nobody agreed to sell fair. Sheriff's already got copies writing to the territorial marshal, as we speak. Vane's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Addie to see the fear underneath it for the first time. Foster, he said, voice gone tight. You're a coward and a drunk. Nobody's going to take your word over mine. Maybe not, Emmett said, and something in his voice had gone steadier than Addie had heard it in years, maybe ever. But my daughter's word, alongside a dead woman's diary, alongside a poisoned spring, with your man's fingerprints all over the jar he left behind, that's not just my word anymore. That's a case, Vane. And you know it, or you wouldn't have ridden out here tonight instead of waiting for a courtroom you knew you couldn't buy your way clear of. For a long, taut moment, nobody moved. The torches crackled. The wind pushed dust across the yard between 2 armed lines waiting for someone to break first. Then Vane's jaw tightened, and Addie saw the exact moment he decided words weren't going to save him anymore. Burn it, he snarled to the men behind him. Burn all of it. What followed happened too fast for Addie to hold onto clearly afterward, just fragments, sharp and disjointed, the way trauma always seemed to fracture memory, into pieces too jagged to fit back together whole. Gunfire. Torches thrown, catching dry brush near the barn. Yiska's voice roaring something in Apache, fierce and furious. The ranchers returning fire, driving back the first wave of Vane's men, before they could close the distance. And her father, her cowardly, drunk, finally brave father, throwing himself between Vane's advancing horse and the cabin door, standing his ground, with nothing but a borrowed pistol, and 2 years of accumulated shame burning off him like fever breaking at last. Pa! Addie's scream tore out of her, as Vane's horse bore down, as a shot rang out, as her father staggered back, clutching his side, blood dark and sudden against his torn coat. But he didn't fall. Didn't fall, though every part of Addie's chest had already convinced itself he had, already begun the terrible free fall, into grief before her mind caught up to what her eyes were actually seeing. Emmett staggered, but held his ground, raised the pistol, with a shaking hand, and fired. Vane's horse reared, screaming, and the man himself went down hard, into the dirt, the wound in his shoulder dark, and sudden in the torchlight. Whatever fight remained in his hired men broke apart fast, after that, the way hired courage always did once the money behind it hit the ground bleeding. They scattered, torches abandoned, hoofbeats fading fast, into the dark, leaving Vane alone in the dirt, clutching his shoulder, cursing in a voice gone high, and desperate with the particular terror of a man who'd never once imagined losing. Addie ran to her father first, dropping to her knees in the churned dirt, hands pressing hard against the wound in his side, tears streaming hot and unstoppable down her face. "Papa, stay with me, don't you dare." "Told you," Emmett managed, voice weak but steady, something like peace settling strange and unfamiliar across his pale face. "Told you I'd be damned if I let you pay for my cowardice twice." "You're not dying," Addie said fiercely, pressing harder against the wound, willing it true, through sheer force of will. "Not tonight. Not after everything it took you to finally get here." He didn't die. Came close enough to frighten every last one of them half to death, but Hargrove, riding out at first light alongside the territorial marshal who'd arrived faster than expected, managed to save him, after a long, brutal night of surgery by lamplight on the cabin table. Cormac Vane was arrested, where he lay, shoulder bound tight, face pale with fury, and pain and the slow dawning realization that money wasn't going to buy him clear of this one, not with a marshal's own eyes on the ledgers, the diary, the poison jar still stained dark at the spring's edge. The territory took its time doing what territories did, but justice, slow and imperfect, as it was, eventually came down hard. Vane's empire of quiet cruelty unraveled thread by thread once men stopped fearing him enough to talk, Hollis first, desperate to save his own neck, then two others, then a flood of testimony, that buried Vane under the weight of years of carefully documented greed. He was tried. Convicted. Sent away to a territorial prison, that would keep him far from Marrow Flat for the rest of whatever years he had left. And the valley, slowly, began to breathe easy again. Emmett stayed through the winter, healing slow in the small room, that had once held nothing but a dead woman's forgotten wildflowers, and something mended between father and daughter in those long quiet months, that Addie had never quite let herself hope for. He never became the man he might have been, if grief hadn't hollowed him out, so many years back. But he became, at last, honest. And steady. And present, in the small daily ways, that mattered more than any grand gesture ever could. "I'm proud of you," he told her one evening, watching her work the garden, that had once been Josepha's, now unmistakably her own. "I don't know that I ever said that plain enough, before all this." "You're saying it now," Addie said. "That's what matters." Spring came again, red hills blazing to life around them, the creek running clear, and clean now, that the poison had long since washed downstream and away. It was in that season, months after Vane's conviction, that Addie found the folded document tucked deep in the same trunk that had once held Josepha's diary, a paper she hadn't seen before, drawn up, she realized with a slow catch of breath, the very week Chogan had first ridden to her father's store. A deed. Land, held in her name alone, unconditional, drawn up long before any wedding vows had been spoken between them. She found Chogan by the corral, and held the paper out, hands not quite steady. "You did this, before we ever married," she said. "Before you even knew if I'd say yes." Chogan looked at the paper. Something quiet and unguarded moved across his face. "I did not know what kind of woman you would be," he said. "Only that whatever happened between us, you deserved a door that stayed open. Whether you chose to walk through it toward me, or away, the choice was always meant to be yours alone." Addie's throat tightened, tears rising hot and sudden. Because that was the whole truth of it, laid bare in careful ink months, before either of them had known what this bargain would become. He had never bought her. He had only ever offered her a door, and trusted her enough to choose it herself. I already chose, she said softly, folding the paper back, with careful hands. Every single day since. I'll go on choosing it, for as long as you'll have me. Chogan reached for her then, slow and certain, and the kiss that followed carried none of the caution of that first careful bargain, only the hard-won, unshakable certainty of two people who had chosen each other, again and again, through fire and fever and blood, until choosing had become the truest thing either of them knew. Their daughter was born the following spring, strong-lunged and dark-eyed, arriving on a morning bright enough to fill the whole cabin with gold. Emmett sat in the next room the whole night through, too anxious to sleep, and was the first, after Chogan, to hold his granddaughter, his weathered hands trembling, with a tenderness that had taken him far too long, and far too much blood, to earn back. Chogan knelt beside the bed, hands trembling as he touched the baby's small fingers for the first time, something raw and open moving across a face that had learned, this past year, to carry both grief and joy without letting either one crush the other. She will need two names, he said softly. One for each world she is born into. Addie, exhausted and radiant, looked down at her daughter's face. Then you choose the first, she said. He thought a long moment. Her Apache name will be Litzog. It means she carries the sun. And for the other, Addie said, Josephine. After the woman, whose courage protected this land, before either of us ever set foot on it. Something moved behind Shogun's eyes, grief, still, but softened now, folded gentle around gratitude instead of pain. Josephine Litzog, he said. She will belong to both winds. The years that followed moved the way years always do, quiet and relentless, weaving grief and joy, so tight together, that eventually nobody tried to separate the threads anymore. The ranch grew. Yiska married a woman, from a neighboring Apache community, who brought her own fierce laughter into the cabin's quiet rhythms, and Emmett lived long enough to watch his granddaughter take her first unsteady steps across the yard, long enough, finally, to become the grandfather he had never quite managed to be a father, before passing peacefully one winter, Addie's hand in his, no unfinished business left unspoken between them. Marrow Flat changed too, slow and imperfect, the way towns do, old suspicions never fully erased, but worn thin enough, over the years, that the woman known once, as the girl, who ran off, with the Apache became known, simply, as Addie. Neighbor. Healer. A woman the whole valley had learned to trust, one hard winter at a time. On the 10th anniversary of the night they'd first ridden together, into the Red Hills, Chogan led her up to the ridge overlooking the valley, the same ridge, where he'd once pointed, and said, simply, home. He carried a small bundle of white sage, and cedar, lighting it careful in the fading light, smoke curling soft, into the darkening sky. This is how my people give thanks, he said quietly. Not always with words. Sometimes only with the breath of the earth. Addie stood beside him, her hand finding his the way it always did now, without thought, without hesitation. Then let the earth hear this, she said softly, looking out over the valley, that had once terrified her, that had cost them both, so much, that had finally, hard-won, become theirs. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. He turned to her, something like wonder still moving behind his eyes even, after 10 years, even after everything. Even after all of it, he said. The fear. The fire. The blood. Especially after, she whispered. Because it led me here. Because it led me to you. The wind shifted, soft and warm, carrying the scent of sage and cedar out across the darkening valley, and for one long, held breath, Addie thought she could almost hear it, the old song Josepha had once sworn the land could sing, if a person only knew how to listen. Maybe the spirits Chogan spoke of really were out there, somewhere in the wind. Maybe they had been listening, all along, to every hard-won choice, that had finally brought two broken, stubborn hearts home.